everyone, welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Rendazzo, and it's time to get twisted. We're talking about Twisters, the sequel to Twister, which is a very different kind of sequel than we're used to seeing nowadays, where a lot of the sequels we see nowadays are direct continuations of the first film. Some of them are legacy sequels that take place way beyond the first film's events, but still borrow a lot of characters and themes and callbacks to the first film. And then you have these like spiritual sequels, I will call them, where this is still a legacy sequel. I believe there's like one carryover from the last film, which is like Paul Scheer. But for the most part, Twisters is like its own unique story, set in the same world, obviously, as Twister. I mean, it's our world. There's really no otherworldly stuff going on, but the same kind of location in the world as the first Twister, and kind of dealing with the same exact premise. These storm chasers who go into these big storms and they chase them and they study them and they try to find ways of maintaining them and saving others from them. But I like this kind of sequel because while it is retreading a lot of the same beats as the original film, it doesn't call itself back to the original film very often, or at least doesn't pull a bunch of like memorable, faces and people and imagery, to where it does feel like you could watch this film having not watched the original and feel like you get a full, really enjoyable experience on its own, removed from that original. But if you watch it with the original, it can add just a little bit extra oomph to the sequel while not feeling like they are necessarily married, which I really like, because so many sequels feel like, you have to do your homework. You have to watch all the films in the franchise before you watch the next one. Or they feel like they can stand alone, but they feel bogged down by the mythology and by the callbacks and by the characters that came before it, that it's like, just let it be its own thing. And it's really cool to look at like kind of the journey that Twisters took, because originally it was conceived as this kind of legacy sequel as we know it, with like Helen Hunt returning, and it was going to be about her and Bill Paxton's kids in the movie, which like would have been charming. It would have been fine. I think Joseph Kosinski was attached to make the film, which is really exciting as well, coming off of Top Gun Maverick. So it would have really looked fantastic. It would have been a thrill ride, I'm sure, and it would have had some great callbacks to the original. But then I like how they kind of scrapped that idea and instead decided to go forward with its own kind of concept. While, again, they do borrow a lot of the similar beats, because how much can you do with a movie about giant twisters and tornadoes and people trying to survive them and kind of predict them and prepare for them and chase them and all that stuff that I already mentioned? Like, how much more can you do with it? And instead they decided, let's do a fresh new crop of characters set in the same area, and we'll just deliver on those thrills. We'll really make the tornado the legacy of the legacy sequel, instead of focusing on any old characters, any washed up characters, kind of hitting those legacy beats. The director they eventually got was Lee Isaac Chung, who just did Minari, which is also a great choice, because Minari is so much about that kind of rural atmosphere and the way it utilizes like the kind of wide open spaces in a way that Twisters also kind of really begs for. So I think Lee Isaac Chung was a great filmmaker to pick, also because this film does kind of stretch beyond the technical levels that Minari had. I mean, Minari isn't a very spectacular film in a way, so it's cool to see Lee Isaac Chung try to adapt to this like modern technology and really experiment with these big, bold action sequences and action swings and big CGI moments as well. And I'll say right now, I think the CGI looks pretty good. I mean, everything looks convincing. Obviously, there's a lot of like gray and a lot of stormy aesthetic, which I don't normally like in big blockbusters, because I feel like they kind of bog everything down, especially with superhero movies. But here it actually makes sense, because it's literally about tornadoes. So I don't mind all the grays and dark blues and blacks and all the shades of like dark cement-like colors, because that is exactly what this movie is about, is the storm, is the rain, is the clouds in the sky. So I totally didn't mind it. I think the wind effects, the rain effects, all of that really works super, super well. It feels like a perfect spiritual successor to the original in terms of the style, because it does feel like it's really kind of going there for the most raw, authentic, practical feeling. Even though a lot of it is more CGI based than the original was, I think there is a practicality to how it feels, because they're using that setting really well, and they're staging these sequences in barns, and there's a lot of blades of grass. Like, it just feels very lived in and very raw and real. It doesn't feel like anything is staged in a fake way, even though a lot of it is fake, which is very impressive to see, because a lot of movies nowadays just look so cheap and so fake despite their big budgets. And this one, I think, utilizes its big budget to make it feel real and authentic, especially when you're watching it in something like 4DX, which I didn't have the pleasure of seeing it in, or IMAX, for example, where like you're really getting just like smacked over the head with just the spectacle of it all. So I do think this is a film that really utilizes its budget well. As for the characters that are introduced in this film, we have Daisy Edgar-Jones as Kate Carter. She's very much your stereotypical leading woman. She's got great aspirations, great ambition, but she isn't necessarily the most like kooky or quirky character. But I don't think she needs to be. I think she grounds the film really well because you have these bigger personalities around her, like Glen Powell, who plays Tyler Owens, who has his moments of groundedness, but is a real wild, a rambunctious storm chaser. But he's got such a leading man charisma. I mean, we just talked about Hitman before the weekend started. The weekend has ended, and we're still talking about Glen Powell. And I think the year is going to end, and we're still going to be talking about Glen Powell because he's fantastic in this film. He's just got such a screen presence and a star power that you really don't see nowadays a lot unless you are watching older stars, someone like Tom Cruise or Leonardo DiCaprio, these people who just have a gravitas. I think Glen Powell does as well, where I think he's a really good actor. We saw in Hitman, he can do a lot. He's very versatile, but just him smiling and having the stoic look and kind of connecting with actors and kind of feeding off of the chemistry and bringing his own energy to something, that alone is going to get people in the seats. That alone is going to make him a big star, even if you don't have acting talent. But he thankfully does to back it up. And I like their dynamic because she is a little bit more subdued and he's a much larger than life personality. They really balance each other out really well. I know there's a lot of controversy out there because Steven Spielberg, the executive producer, kind of went on the record saying that he cut the big kiss from the film. And it's one of those things where when I read it, I was like, come on, guys, who cares? But then when I was watching the film, I was like, I really think the kiss should have been there. I really hate to go against my boy Stevie because he's my favorite filmmaker of all time, but I'm like, I don't know. It just feels so natural. I mean, the two have such great chemistry and the chemistry builds so well that I wanted to see the smooch. I wanted to see it. And they even like build to it in a really proper way where it's like the classic tap on the shoulder, girl turns around, the guy is standing there and the light is projecting behind them and the wind is blowing through their hair. And then they're just ending the film there. I really, really wanted the smooch, but maybe we'll get it if they make another sequel with these characters. Other characters you have Anthony Ramos as Javi, who I think is probably the less impressive of the three. I haven't really loved a lot of his work post In the Heights. I loved him in Hamilton. I think he has a real great energy when he's in musicals, but I feel like as like a dramatic actor and in a lot of these franchise films, I have yet to be like blown away by him. Pun intended, I guess, because Twisters and Wind. But I do think Anthony Ramos is good. It's just when he's going up against Glen Powell, who has star power for days, and Daisy Edgar-Jones, who's like one of my current like Hollywood crushes. I love her so much. She's just so fantastic. Like it's hard to compete with two of the best in the game right now. But you also have a very exciting supporting performance from David Corenswet, who is going to be our new Superman. And I think you get a lot of good shades of what he could bring in that role. I think you get a great supporting role from Maura Tierney as Kate's mother, Kathy. I think Sasha Lane is great in this film. We just saw her in Loki. Katie O'Brien has a really small role, but brings a lot to her role. She was just seen in Love Lies Bleeding. A lot of these actors who like are actors that you've seen in a lot of things, but they're not necessarily the front and center of this film. But I think that's something important to note, is that there are no small roles, only small actors. And I think because you have these really talented actors in these bit parts, these don't feel like bit parts. It feels like everyone has their distinct personalities. And this is, while very focused on Glen Powell and Daisy Edgar-Jones's characters, and to an extent Anthony Ramos's characters, because you have such colorful supporting characters around them, it feels like a fun kind of buddy, almost like a road trip movie, even though they're not really on the road going somewhere. They're still on the road a lot because they're in these cars, but it has that kind of like communal, like let's get the gang together type feels that is really, really nice to see. And it kind of does harken back to those blockbusters of like the 80s and the 90s when the original Twister came out, where it's just these really fun hoorah adventure films. They don't really have a ton of like intellectual stuff on their brains, and this does deal with some of the sciencey aspects. I actually think the film is at its weakest when it tries to over explain the science of things. I think you have a Twister, you have these people, you have a bunch of wind, a bunch of special effects, a lot of big spectacle, and that's it. You know, like I don't think you necessarily need all the different layers of, you know, explaining the science behind it all. But if you are into the science of it, you're probably going to really enjoy this. I just personally, you know, didn't necessarily need that to feel the thrill and feel the enjoyment, because at the end of the day, this is a spectacle through and through. This is just a fun time at the movies. And I think a lot of the times blockbusters want to try to be so much more than that. But I think when they can just step back and be like, you know what, we're going to entertain first and foremost. We're going to find compelling arcs for these characters without necessarily feeling like we need to like reach real hard for that Oscar. We're just going to tell like a pretty simple, really engaging story. We're going to have one or two characters that you can really connect with, some fun supporting characters, and just some great spectacle and great action. And I think this film delivers because of that, because it doesn't feel the need to try to be anything bigger than it already is. And it already is something really big. I mean, the nature of these special effects sequences are enough that even if this was just like a clip montage of different action sequences without the character stuff at all, like I still think you'd have a fun time at the movies, because this is the type of movie that you can really just soak up all those giant giant images and really find a lot to enjoy with. So I really like Twisters. I don't think it's one of the best of the year or even the best of the summers, but that's not really a slight on the film as much as it is. I just think other films probably cater to my taste a little bit more. But this is very thrilling. There's a final action set piece in this thing involving a movie theater that I thought was just one of the coolest final action set pieces I've ever seen. And it was really fun watching it in a movie theater. There's just a real immersion there. And I've talked about so many blockbusters this summer that have broke my immersion, and this is the total opposite, where I was immersed the entire way through. And I didn't see this in IMAX. I didn't see this in 4DX. I didn't need the wind actually physically blowing on me and the rain coming up from the seats. I would have loved that. I still want to go see that in 4DX when they re-release it, hopefully at the end of August. I heard they're going to probably bring the original Twister back in 4DX as well. I really can't wait to see that. But I didn't need all that. I was immersed just by watching it because Lee Isaac Chung really did a great job visualizing this thing. So I really recommend it. If you want just a great time at the movies, go see Twisters. It's so much fun. It's got great star power. It can appease those who are into the science of it, or just appease those like me who are just in it for the fun and the spectacle and the thrills. And I do also want to acknowledge there are people in the world who actually suffer from really terrible damage due to tornadoes, and I don't think this film shies away from that either. I know this could be triggering to some people, and I do want to give that warning right now, but I also think this is a very respectful way in how it handles the survivors of these storms and how it addresses that and how it really makes a statement in trying to advocate for protection for the people who are hit hard by these storms. So I think it even goes that extra mile as well, which I really, really appreciate for it. But I know a lot of people are liking it, and I hope more people get around to seeing it, especially because I do believe Regal is bringing it back in 4DX at the end of the month. So please go check it out if you can in that way, because I'd love to hear what your experiences are with 4DX, because I've heard it's just a wild time. But that is my review for Twisters. Thank you so much for watching. We've only got a couple more of these summer reviews left to go. On Wednesday, I will be talking about perhaps the biggest movie of the summer, which is Inside Out 2. It's one that a lot of people have asked for, and that's what you'll be getting. And then Friday, I'm giving you my top 10 of the summer, which will include even more reviews of movies I still haven't talked about on here. I will tell you right now, there's some that are on that list that I haven't even mentioned to anyone yet that I'm sure a lot of people are going to be excited to hear about. So please stay tuned and hope you enjoy the end of your August. Go see Twisters if you haven't. And thanks so much for watching.